We are back in our lectionary today, but instead of being in the book of Mark, we are in the book of John. So last week you'll recall, and I think this is why the lectionary set it up this way. Last week we kind of did these two stories and skipped the bit in the middle. And the bit in the middle was the Jesus feeds the 5,000 and the walking on water story. And so this week it's like kicked us back over into the book of John, and they're the two stories that we'll be looking at today because they are here for us in John chapter 6. Now, one of the things that is a challenge in doing things this way is that the different authors have different agendas. So Mark is trying to say a particular thing and John is trying to say a particular thing. So when the lectionary gets us to do the beginning and the end from one book and then the middle from another book, it gets the narrative right, but it kind of kills the thematic stuff and what the authors are trying to do. So we're going to address this just as John has addressed it and pretend that the stuff we learned in Mark was a totally separate thing. So we're going to start out, I think, that we are doing from verses, 1 to 21 today in chapter 6 of John. And is that text big enough for you guys to see there? Or do you want me to make it bigger? No, we're good? All right, excellent. So we're going to start out here. It says sometime after this. Now, so remember, we look at our context. The previous stuff here is just like this is a totally different section. So when it says sometime after this, it literally means the story is, we don't need to worry too much about what happened immediately before this. So sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far side of the Sea of Galilee. That is the Sea of Tiberias. And this is where we get to the fun bit. I even have a different map here for you today. So this map here literally just shows us, I don't think I can zoom on this. This is just the Sea of Galilee. And you'll see Tiberias is this city down here on the, western coast of the Sea of Galilee. But in our scripture verse, it says that it's the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. So Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. That is the Sea of Tiberias. So John, the author here, is giving us a clear indication. He's saying, why? Like he's telling us it's not just the Sea of Galilee, it's the Sea of Tiberias. So there's a reason for that, because it doesn't get called that in any of the other Gospels, I don't think. But what it's saying is, remember that this is also, the people are under the rule of Rome. It's like a reminder for us of the subjugation of the Jewish people under Rome. So it's the Sea of Galilee, but the Romans call it the Sea of Tiberias. So you'll see here, Tiberias is here, and that's where they get the Sea of Tiberias. And it says Jesus has crossed over to the other side. Is that what it says? To the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. Now, there's a lot of contention about where this story actually happens, which is why having the map here is really helpful. Because we have the feeding of the 5,000, and there are a number of different places that people think this happened. And it's confused because we have the feeding of the 5,000, but then we also, in other Gospels, have the feeding of the 4,000. So the feeding of the 4,000, we reckon, happened kind of down here. So this is where, similar to the same area that the Jesus cast out the demon called Legion. That's over here in the Gerasenes near this city of Gergesa. There's like hills and caves and stuff here where that happened. So the feeding of the 5,000 though is in all four Gospels, which is interesting because it is the only miracle that is in or sign that is in all four of the Gospels. So it's a kind of a big deal. That is with the exception of the resurrection, which definitely made an appearance in all four Gospels. But for John, he calls these things signs or semeion, which is where from the Latin signum, and that's where we get our word signal and insignia and signature. So that's where we get signs. And the first kind of sign. So the book of John has 7 signs. So the whole story, the narrative arc is built around these 7 signs, really 8 if you include the resurrection. But there's some contention over which is which. But basically, you have the turning of water into wine as the first sign in John chapter 2, the healing of the official son in John chapter 4, the healing of the lame man in chapter 5, then the feeding of the multitude or 5,000, which is where we are now in chapter 6, which is then shortly followed by the walking on the water, and then the healing of the blind man in John 9, the raising of Lazarus in John 11. So that's the the signs in the book of John kind of create that narrative arc. And some people then say that the resurrection is an eighth sign. So you have like the 7 days of creation. I know it's weird. The 7 days of creation, and then the eighth sign would be like an eighth day, which is to say Jesus is making a new creation. So it's like an extra. It's the creation plus one. That some people think that that is what John's trying to allude to. I think that there are better ways to characterize what John is doing than some weird eighth day thing. But definitely the 7 signs are the way that he holds that narrative arc together. So if we go back to our map though, most people think that the feeding of the 5,000 happened up here at Bethsaida. But there are some people, and if you go there today to this place here, Tabitha, there is actually like a monastery there, and they have a cool bell thing, bell tower, and there's a whole bunch of mosaics, which in the in the like architecture and buildings all around this region, mosaics are a huge big deal. And there are mosaics that date back many, many hundreds of years. And in this particular place, there is a mosaic that has some loaves and fishes and stuff. And this is where pilgrims would go, and they would remember this feeding at the 5,000 story. The irony of that is that whoever it was that designed the mosaic in that particular monastery obviously wasn't fishing in the region, because the type of fish that are in the mosaic don't exist in the Sea of Galilee. There is a special fish they call now the St. Peter's fish, and it only has, I think it's a single dorsal fin, which is kind of distinct. So the mosaic is actually of the wrong fish. So this area is where they think it is. And if you're just out of interest, we have Capernaum here. And then if you can see my mouse pointer, the Mount of Beatitudes is right about here. So the people who would say that, between kind of Chorazin and Capernaum and Tabitha, there is the Mount of Beatitudes up here. So this is not a long distance. Let me jump to a different atlas for a sec. If I zoom in here, so you can see here, the distance from Capernaum or to the water here is about 3 kilometers. So this is the kind of distance from the water's edge to the Mount of Beatitudes. Now, the reason it says that he crosses over to the other side, and later on it actually tells us how far he went, and it says that they were about, they say that they'd rowed about 4 miles or something like that. So the distance from Bethsaida to Capernaum, can I get Capernaum to show up again? This distance here is about 4 miles. So it says that they were in their sailboat, not rowing, I suspect they were sailing, that they were about 3 to 3.5 in our kilometers for us there. And that's about where Jesus walked out to them. So to suggest that they were right here doesn't make any sense. For Jesus to get back in his boat to go to Capernaum, the distances involved don't make any sense for Jesus to be here. So it makes much more sense for him to be at Bethsaida. And I don't think that he was down this far. So if we jump back to our Bible, it says sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of Galilee, of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias. So again, it's saying, hey, remember, the Romans are in charge here. This is a way that John can establish for us that the Jewish audience are still subjugated under Rome. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs. Another reason that it doesn't make a lot of sense for Jesus to be all the way down the coast here is because this was less populated. This is densely populated along this side. And Bethsaida, there is at least a city there. But the further we go down this coastline, the idea that people followed Jesus down there is not as likely. A great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. And then Jesus went up on a mountainside. I love the map, so I'm going back. If he went up on a mountainside, if he was here where the pilgrims say this happened, he would be going up the Mount of Beatitudes. And I feel like they would have mentioned that as a significant thing, because he kept going up there from Capernaum and from this area, but it doesn't mention that. So I think he just went up on the mountain near Bethsaida and sat down with his disciples. And the Jewish Passover festival was near. Okay, so this is important that the Jewish Passover festival was near, because 3 times John, in writing this book, he talks about the Passover festival happening. The first time is marked by the cleansing of the temple, where Jesus turns over the tables and drives out all the animals with a whip. And that, for some people, they say that's actually one of the signs. And they skip out, instead of having the, I forget which sign they skip. I don't know. They include that, though, the cleansing of the temple as a sign. Nonetheless, we end up here with the Jewish Passover, and that first festival was marked by Jesus turning the tables over, and now this second one is what they're talking about, and the third one is when Jesus enters into Jerusalem for the last time before his crucifixion. So the Jewish Passover festival was near. This is also important because John is saying something big is happening here. Pay attention. In his narrative, the Passover marks something important. And for us here, this is kind of the story that follows. And the John chapter 6, the whole chapter is kind of built around this idea of almost of a Eucharist. So John doesn't include the Eucharist. He has the washing of the disciples' feet, but the Eucharistic supper, that last supper communion thing, this is the chapter where John kind of covers that thematically. So we go from John chapter 6, we start here with the feeding of the 5,000 and the idea of Jesus providing bread. And then we have the walking on water, but then we get into Jesus teaching about being the bread of life, which is, we'll end up there. I think that's next week. All right, so where are we? Passover festival. The other reason this is important is the imagery of the Passover talks about Moses. So Moses is actually a key character in the book of John, which doesn't make a lot of sense because Moses is obviously from hundreds and 1,000 and a bit years earlier. I don't know how long. I don't know the timeline for how long Moses was before Jesus. Off the top of my head, it's more than 1,000 years. Either way, this is an important thing because John has this idea that Jesus is like a new Moses. So we have this imagery through the book of John, and I'm going to talk about this a lot when we talk about, I think it is next week. But Jesus is the new and superior Moses. So he is better than Moses in every way. So Moses was a prophet that came and led them out of slavery and bondage through the wilderness and then to the promised land. And Jesus is superior to him. And this is the beginning of that kind of story arc here, where we open with the Passover, which is the thing that Moses instituted for them. So we keep going. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" And he asked this only to test them, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Now, this is, again, John has an agenda, and he is echoing back to the Old Testament here. And you might recall stories with both Elijah and Elisha where they had miraculous provision of food. And so one of those was with Elisha, with the 2 Kings 4:43. It says, "How can I set this before 100 men?" his servant asked. So they're basically, Elisha doesn't have enough food, and the servant says, "What are we going to do?" But Elisha answers, "Give it to the people to eat, for this is what the Lord says, they will eat and have some left over." And you'll note that that's an important key. So there is a miraculous provision of food and there is some left over. And then the same thing we find in Numbers 11 when Moses he's complaining to God. He's saying, "How am I going to feed all these people? Where will we get meat for all these people?" And the people complain, and then God provides the manna from heaven and the birds as well. So there is this idea of Jesus being like the prophets of the Old Testament, in particular like Elisha and like Moses. And then so Philip here has a bit of a whinge. Philip says, "Where shall we buy bread for all these people to eat?" And Jesus is testing him. And then Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." It's interesting in Bible translation how they choose to say here more than half a year's wages. Because if I turn on our Greek here, you'll see half a year's wages doesn't actually say that in the Greek at all. You can see down here in this last sense, am I in the way? Where it says 200 denarius. That's what these, this is denarion here. So this is 200 denarius. We don't know what 200 denarius means nowadays. So when they translate that to English, they just say 6 months' wages or half a year's wages, because that's a more universal way to describe that. How are we going to do that? How are we going to have 6 months' wages to buy enough bread so that everyone can have something to eat? Another of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many? Now, I've talked about Andrew before. He's kind of a bit of a hero here. Andrew is always bringing people to Jesus. Every time Andrew gets mentioned, he's bringing someone to Jesus. And this time he is bringing a small boy who has some loaves of barley and a few small fish. So Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place. And they sat down, and about 5,000 men were there. This is interesting, the idea that there was plenty of grass in that place. So knowing that it's Passover and knowing that there's plenty of grass at the time, that kind of dates the scripture for us around springtime, because that's when the grass would grow up and be green. In fact, this is in the other Gospels as well. It talks about a green or grassy hillside being a feature. And so we can say, okay, this is kind of springtime there, because after the springtime, what would happen is the Arabian desert, the winds would come off the desert, they'd be hot and they'd just kill all the grass. So the fact that there is green grass tells us when this was. I even looked up a psalm for you guys here. In Psalm 103, 15 and 16, it says, the life of mortals is like grass. They flourish like a flower of the field. The wind blows over it and it is gone, and its place remembers it no more. So this is a psalm about how that hot wind comes and kills off all of the flowers in the field. So that's how we get the impression that this is in the springtime. So it's kind of nice, and they're sitting on their grassy hill, and Jesus gets them to sit down. They recline there, and Jesus then took the loaves and he gave thanks. And you'll see this word gave thanks here, Eucharisteo. This is where we get our word Eucharist from, to give thanks. And Eucharist then is I guess in the Catholic tradition, when they talk about communion, they talk about Eucharist. We would normally say communion in the tradition that I grew up in. So that's what's going on here. Jesus took the loaves and then he gave thanks, and he distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish. And when they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted. So this is kind of like that, those Old Testament prophets who had some left over. And this is important because when John is kind of characterizing Jesus to be a new Moses, when Moses with whoops, I killed my camera. Give me a sec. I think I've unplugged myself. All right. We're back in business. All right. I'm very sorry. Okay. Does anyone remember what I was up to? Where was I up to? Yeah, let's go back. Let's just kick back off here. So they gathered them and they filled the baskets with the pieces of 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. So yeah, when Moses did this in the desert, they weren't allowed to collect anything. There was only what was left over, and then that was kind of the end of it. And every day they had to collect more because they had to trust in God's provision. So when we see Jesus doing this miracle and they collect up all the extra, there is something in this where it's almost like John is saying, Jesus is better at this than Moses. With Moses, you had just enough, but with Jesus, you have excess. There is more. So that is kind of, again, in this, because as this chapter goes on, and as we see, and I am pretty sure it's next week, we will see that increasingly John presents Jesus as a type of Moses, but way superior to Moses. And the reason, and I think actually that comes up, in this next verse, why I'm saying it means that. I'm not just making that up. It's in the text here as well. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over. by those who had eaten. And after the people saw the sign Jesus performed, this is that sign, semeion. So the seven signs are all called signs in the book of John. They're not called powers or dunamis, which is what we translate as miracles in the other Gospels. For John always calls them signs. I'm getting distracted, but part of the reason he calls them signs is because when Moses came to Pharaoh, there was all these miraculous signs. So it uses that same language of semeion there as signs. Or if you look in John, when he's speaking with Nicodemus, and he talks about the sign of the serpent staff going up, and they all had to look to the sign in order to be healed. That same in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, they use that same word, semeion, to describe that as well. So this language is really, really key to John's agenda. So after the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. So that is actually a reference to, does it show here? Yeah. Deuteronomy 18:15. It says, the Lord your God will raise up for you. You can't see that tooltip there. Let me change the whole chapter there for you. 18. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth. He will do them everything I command him. I myself will call to account anyone. So this prophet who will come like Moses is the person that they are talking about in this verse when it says, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. So they're saying, is he the prophet like Moses? Surely he is, because like Moses, he provides bread for us, like Moses provided bread in the wilderness. Now remember, John has also said, this is the Sea of Tiberias. He's saying, hey, you guys are subjugated under Rome. So there is this idea that a subjugated people are looking to be set free. And now one like Moses has come. And this one like Moses is providing bread for them, the same that Moses did in the wilderness. Now Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. So this word, I'm pretty sure here, abtadzo, this is like they're trying to, it says to snatch here in the sense of that word there. They want to grab him and pull him into their agenda, is what it's saying. They want to make him king in violent revolution. They're saying, this is the one who is to come. This is the new Moses. The old Moses saved us from the Egyptians, and the old Moses provided bread for us in the wilderness, and the old Moses did these things. So the new Moses, he's going to do it. We want to bring him in. He is not just Jesus, who is the prophet like Moses. It says that he is king. He is this word basileus. It's where we get our word basilica. So he is going to be king. So they go from he is the prophet to he should be king, or another way we would describe that as Messiah, very, very quickly. They intended to come and make him king by force. So Jesus withdrew again to a mountain by himself. So we're back in our atlas. They're over here in Bethsaida, and Jesus has cruised up one of these mountains. So you'll see here from the coast of near around Bethsaida, it's about a 3-kilometer walk or 4-kilometer walk to get up to any of that mountain range. So it's not an especially long way. So Jesus has seen that they want to elevate him in a violent coup, and he's not ready for that. So he nicks off into the mountains. Then we get to our next part of the story here. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake. So they were already up a little bit in the mountains, remember, when Jesus was teaching. And where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. So this also is good evidence. So if I zoom in, you'll see Capernaum is here. If they were right here, they wouldn't have gone across anywhere to get to Capernaum. So they needed to really, in order for this scripture to make sense, they needed to be on this east coast. So they got into the coast, into their boat about here, and then Capernaum is 4.5 kilometers if you go straight across there, which if we jump back to our Bible, it says, by now it was dark and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing and the waters grew rough. Now, 3 kilometers is far enough. If the strong wind is blowing, it's totally taken them off course. And it's getting dark, and because the evening has come, and this lake is big enough that it can get seriously choppy out there. Like I've been out there, and it's not just like a stagnant pond. Like it's the Sea of Galilee, and it really does have waves, and they are in a pretty small boat in the scheme of things. So when they had rowed, okay, so they are rowing at this point, about 3 or 4 miles. So let's go have a look. So they're going out here, and they've gone, oops, oh man, let me close that. Okay, so they're a bit off course. They're going out in the middle. 3 or 4 miles still puts them, so I reckon they must have been further down the coast than Bethsaida. All right, so they're about here. 3 or 4 miles. They're not quite at Capernaum. They're on their way there, somewhere just shy of Capernaum. That's our 3 or 4 mile marker there on the map. Then they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. This is our word here, phobeo, where we get phobia. They were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Now, I think it's fair enough they're frightened for a few reasons. Firstly, there's some creepy guy walking on the water in the middle of the night. So I don't know if it doesn't tell us whether or not it says they saw Jesus approaching the boat. We don't know if John is saying after the fact that, well, it was Jesus, or if they just saw someone who they later found out was Jesus. So for all I know, they just had a silhouette of some creepy, eerie, ghostly figure cruising across the water. But even if it was Jesus, they've literally just ditched the guy. They were meant to wait for him probably. He went up a mountain, it got dark, and they were like, oh, well, stuff him. So they left without him. And then Jesus, he started walking out to the water, and they're freaking out. And Jesus says to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Now, you might recall this statement, "It is I," ego, eimi. This is in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. This is the same words that God uses in Exodus 3:14 when he speaks to Moses at the burning bush. And he says, "Hey, it's me. It's I am who I am." It's the same language. So Jesus is essentially taking on in the text here the persona of Yahweh. But it's more than that. Moses was the guy that was a deliverer who came to set free and oppress people, and he gave them food in the wilderness, but he also took them across through the Red Sea. So the imagery that John is painting for us here is one of Jesus, who is going to set them free, they think, from Roman oppression, but also that he will provide for them in the wilderness and the Aramis. But also Jesus now is superior to Moses. He parted the sea, but Jesus just walked straight across it. We have this imagery that likens Christ to Moses in this as well. And then they were willing, Then they were willing to take him into the boat. And immediately, here we have our uthus, that's the Mark is keen on that word. And immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. So they'd gone 3 or 4 miles. And then immediately after Jesus got in the boat, they were close to where they needed to go. So if they were 3 or 4 miles slightly down the coast from Bethsaida, that would be, Jesus gets in the boat somewhere around here, and then they manage to find their way across into Capernaum. So that's kind of why we have a rough idea of where we think that feeding of the 5,000 happened. Now we actually finished there, but I want to read this first verse that I think we'll read next week as well. It says, "The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there, and that Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but they had gone away alone." The reason I wanted to add that extra verse is some people have suggested that, that there's some trickery in this verse, that Jesus didn't really, maybe he got a lift over and he was just standing in the shallow water on the other side or something. Or there's no way Jesus could have run all the way around the coast and beat them. And they were shocked. Everyone knew it. And John's making a point here to say everyone was shocked. Jesus was not meant to reappear over in Capernaum. He's still somewhere on the other side of the lake, but it turns out he wasn't. Once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats. They went over to Capernaum. They had to go find him there. All right. So there is our passages for today. The question is, what do we learn from this? Now, I'd love if people have something to add here. By all means, jump in. I would suggest that there are a few kind of lessons for us here. The first one is that we should bring our challenges to Jesus. So that first part of the story, if we go back to the beginning of John 6 here, let me get rid of that. They had a problem. They had a problem. They had to feed all these people. They didn't know what to do. Philip didn't know what to do. He's like, I don't have the money to do this. Andrew didn't know what to do, but he brought this the problem to Jesus, and then Andrew actually also brought this child to Jesus. So not only should we bring our challenges to Jesus, especially when we don't know how to solve them, but we should also bring what we have to Jesus. In this case, Andrew brought the young boy with his loaves and his fishes. Another lesson from this, and now some people in more modern history have tried to suggest that this is actually just an epic guilt trip. So they brought this kid forward and he's provided these loaves and fishes, and everyone else has thought, oh geez, maybe I'm being stingy. So they've opened their bag and it turns out they had enough for 12 extra baskets. Like, well, I just think that's clearly nonsense. That's not what this story is alluding to. This story is clearly saying it's a sign, it's a miracle, something incredible has happened here. So this is not just a guilt trip where we see that one person gives, so we should all give. But there is still something here of this idea that we should be willing to share what we have and to trust to Jesus to meet our needs. But what's important here is when we trust to Jesus to meet our needs, this is not some kind of proof text for a prosperity gospel. Barley loaves and fishes was poor people food. This was not an elaborate, lavish meal like Herod was eating down in his palace. This was a simple fare. This was Jesus providing enough. But it's not any kind of justification for a prosperity gospel that says that we should be rich and wealthy at the expense of someone else. But really, the story arc here is one of Jesus, where John is beginning to present Jesus both as a superior type of Moses, being from the Old Testament, a new prophet that would come like Moses. But also we're beginning to see this narrative about Jesus providing the bread, and that moves for the rest of this chapter. The theme is about Jesus being the bread of life. So we're going to look at that next week. So I won't preempt that. I'm pretty sure that's when it is.